On August 1, 2008, 18 experienced mountaineers stood on the summit of K2, the world's second tallest peak. It was the largest single-day summit push the mountain had ever seen. Less than 24 hours later, 11 of those climbers were dead. Some fell thousands of feet into glacial abyss. Some were crushed by collapsing ice. Some succumbed to oxygen depletion and hypothermia in pitch-black night. Rescuers who climbed up to save lives also perished in the chaos. What followed was the deadliest 24 hours in K2's recorded history. This is the true, unaltered story of the 2008 K2 disaster, a catastrophe forged not by a single storm, but by accumulated delays, fatal timing errors, brutal terrain, and unforgiving mountain physics. K2, known to climbers as the Savage Mountain, holds the highest fatality rate among all 8,000-meter peaks. While Everest's mortality rate hovers around 4%, K2's death toll sits at 29%. Nearly 1 in every 4 climbers who reaches its summit never returns home. Unlike Everest, which sits in the heavily trafficked Himalayan range, K2 stands isolated in the remote Karakoram Mountains. Its vertical structure is uniquely punishing, a 4,700-meter vertical rise from base camp to summit, with an average gradient exceeding 45 degrees. Steep, exposed ice rock faces, hidden crevasses, loose scree, and frequent serac collapses make every meter of ascent and descent unforgiving. Weather on K2 is notoriously unstable, with conditions capable of shifting from calm to lethal in just 3 hours. Sudden blizzards, sub-zero temperatures as low as -50 degrees Celsius, and hurricane-force winds over 25 meters per second can trap climbers at high altitude with zero chance of rescue. The narrow, infamous stretch near the summit, known as the bottleneck, is K2's deadliest zone. An 80-degree near-vertical ice chute capped by massive, overhanging seracs. These unstable ice blocks loom directly above the only passage. There is no cover, no escape, no margin for error. More K2 fatalities have occurred in this single section than anywhere else on the mountain. In the summer of 2008, 8 international climbing teams converged in northern Pakistan, waiting for the season's only stable weather window. All members were seasoned high-altitude climbers with extensive expedition experience. None were amateurs. They understood K2's reputation. They understood the risk. After traveling Skardu and traveling along the Karakoram Highway, the teams reached the final human settlement at Arskol, 3,040 meters above sea level. Beyond this point, no roads, no shelter, no help. Only a 7-day trek through glacial terrain, river crossings, and loose boulder fields leads to K2's base camp at 5,100 meters. By early July, all teams had arrived and settled in. The standard waiting period was 2 months. Climbers endured thin air, limited fuel, and rationed food, relying entirely on local Sherpas and high-altitude porters for resupply. The long, fragile supply chain meant any weather disruption could cut off resources entirely. Stalling too long at base camp weakened their bodies before the final push even began. Between base camp and the summit lie 4 progressively exposed high-altitude camps. Camp 1 at 5,800 meters, Camp 2 at 6,700 meters, Camp 3 at 7,400 meters, and the final assault Camp 4 at 7,800 meters. Each segment features steep ice walls, knife-edge ridges, and wind-exposed terrain where tents can be destroyed in minutes. Throughout late July, teams rotated up and down the route to fix safety ropes, complete acclimatization training, and wait for viable weather. On August 1, 2008, the perfect window finally arrived. Low wind, mild temperatures, the most stable climbing condition of the entire season. At midnight, before sunrise, Sherpa guides and high-altitude porters began their ascent from Camp 4. Their job was to fix the final stretch of safety ropes for the summit teams. This pre-dawn preparation is standard for K2 summit pushes, designed to give climbers safe passage and maximize daylight hours for ascent and descent. At 7,800 meters, they discovered a critical issue. The team carried insufficient rope. The planned safety route could not be completed. With no other option, the Sherpa crew was forced to descend back to Camp 4 to retrieve more equipment. This unnecessary round trip burned through hours of irreplaceable early morning climbing time. By the time rope fixing resumed, the entire summit timeline was severely delayed, pushing the team into a high-risk schedule they could never recover from. Several climbers recognized the danger of the lost time. A late summit meant a far later descent, forcing teams to traverse the deadly bottleneck in darkness. These climbers made the deliberate call to abandon their attempt and wait for another day. But the majority of the group chose to continue. After months of waiting at base camp, they refused to surrender the only viable weather window of the season. By 8 a.m., full daylight, the rope-fixing work was finally completed. The delayed summit push officially began. Dozens of climbers roped up and moved slowly toward the summit, already exhausted from thin air and hours of lost time. The high-altitude environment sapped their strength instantly. Every step required deliberate effort. The group stretched into a long, scattered line across the upper slopes, leaving climbers isolated and vulnerable if trouble struck. At 8,200 meters, the mountain claimed its first victim. Serbian climber Dragan Mandic grew frustrated with the slow pace and sought to speed up his ascent. To move faster, he unclipped his safety harness from the fixed rope. Mid-stride, he lost his footing on the sheer ice. Mandic reached for the rope, but the fall was unstoppable. He tumbled more than 100 meters down the steep ice slope. When team members reached his body, he had no pulse. He was instantly killed by the impact. A group of porters and climbers attempted to recover Mandic's body during the rescue effort. Pakistani high-altitude porter Baig began displaying severe altitude sickness symptoms. He staggered uncontrollably, unable to maintain balance in the oxygen-starved environment. Seconds later, Baig slipped and fell down the same vertical slope. There was no possibility of survival at that height. In less than an hour, 2 lives were lost. The double death shattered team morale. Many climbers who had already reached 8,200 meters made the immediate decision to turn back. Traffic jams formed on the narrow single-file route, further slowing the progress of the remaining summit-bound climbers. Every delay compounded the growing danger. Against mounting risk, a core group of determined climbers continued upward, advancing toward K2's infamous bottleneck. Here, an 80-degree vertical ice chute sits directly beneath massive, overhanging seracs. The ice formations are unstable, unpredictable, and constantly shifting. No climber can pass through this zone safely for long. It is K2's most lethal terrain. The remaining team moved through the bottleneck quickly and cautiously. Miraculously, no ice fell during their passage. They cleared the mountain's most lethal section, but the fatal timing delays they had accumulated earlier guaranteed the worst was still to come. The first summiter reached the top at 4:30 p.m. The final climber arrived at 7:30 p.m. In total, 18 people successfully summited K2. It was a historic achievement for the season, but the late summit times sealed their fate. Daylight was vanishing fast. The critical descent window was almost gone. What followed was the deadliest phase of the entire expedition. As climbers descended back into the bottleneck after dark, the seracs finally collapsed. A massive block of ice broke free from the overhang and crashed onto the descending line. Norwegian climber Bob Beck was struck directly by the falling ice. His wife, climbing directly behind him, witnessed his instantaneous death with no way to intervene. The collapsing ice destroyed nearly all fixed ropes in the bottleneck. The primary safety route was completely eliminated. Climbers above the bottleneck were trapped at extreme altitude with no secured passage down. Faced with certain death if they stayed, the group split into 2 desperate choices: descend blindly in complete darkness without safety ropes, or bivouac overnight in the lethal bottleneck zone. A small group chose to bivouac. The rest attempted a night descent. Without ropes, without reliable oxygen, without visibility, the descent became a fight for survival. During the night descent, French climber Hervé Dabadé completely exhausted his oxygen supply. Weakened by hypoxia and freezing temperatures, he lost his balance and fell into the darkness. His headlamp vanished into the glacier void. He never reappeared. By early August 2nd, 8 climbers remained trapped in the bottleneck. Dutch climber Roland van der Meulen began suffering acute snow blindness, his vision rapidly deteriorating. Knowing he could not survive a long delay, he pushed downward as fast as possible. During his descent, van der Meulen discovered 3 South Korean climbers entangled in broken ropes. Some were hanging upside down, severely injured and bleeding. They were still alive, but trapped, immobile. Van der Meulen assessed his own failing vision and depleted strength. He recognized that attempting a rescue would likely result in his own death as well. Instead, he continued down to Camp 4 to alert the Sherpa rescue team. Irish climber Gerard MacDonald arrived at the same scene and chose differently. He immediately began working to free the trapped Korean climbers. While rescuing them, severe high-altitude hallucinations overtook him. Suffering from oxygen deprivation, MacDonald turned upward and began climbing toward the summit against all logic and all warnings from the stranded climbers. Seconds later, a second major serac collapse hit the bottleneck. Falling ice crushed Gerard MacDonald and nearby Pakistani porter Meban. Both died instantly. Back at Camp 4, Roland van der Meulen's emergency report triggered an immediate rescue attempt. 2 highly experienced Nepalese Sherpas climbed through the night to reach the 3 stranded Korean climbers. Upon arrival, the rescuers faced an unbearable reality. 1 Korean climber was critically injured, with 0 chance of survival. To save the 2 remaining viable climbers, the team was forced to leave the fatally injured member behind. It was a life-or-death triage decision made under extreme duress. The 2 Sherpas and 2 rescued Korean climbers began their descent. Before they could clear the bottleneck, a 3rd catastrophic ice collapse buried the entire group. All 4 were killed instantly. When the weather finally stabilized and the disaster ended, the final toll was confirmed. Over just 24 hours, 11 climbers had perished on K2. It remains the single deadliest event in the mountain's climbing history. On August 4th, military helicopters reached base camp to airlift the severely injured survivors. But no rescue could bring back the 11 lives lost in the upper death zone. Today, a stone memorial with metal plaques stands at the base of K2, engraved with the names of every climber who has died on its slopes. K2 has never truly been conquered. Human beings are only ever briefly, conditionally permitted to stand upon its summit.